Welcome to the Digital Responsibility Podcast. There is a vibrant community around the world exploring how we drive forward digital innovation, products and services, and generally exploit technology progression for the sustained benefit of society and the planet. On this podcast, you will hear from me, Christopher Johnson, and Rob Price, two of the original founders of Corporate Digital Responsibility, as we speak to our guests to hear their stories and piece together what it means to be responsible in the digital age. If you'd like to learn more, take a look at the website, corporatedigitalresponsibility.net.
Welcome to season 5, episode 3 of the podcast. Steve, you and I were talking just now. I am quite, I think it's the first time that it's an organisation that I am a customer of. So delighted to kind of bring you to the podcast, delighted that you're able to attend. Steve Tibble from Vollebak. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Okay, for people who can't see me, which I think is everybody, I'm 44 years old. I'm British and I run a company with my twin brother. And our aim is to simply make clothes from the future, which breaks down as some of the most advanced clothing ever made, specifically addressing the challenges that we feel are going to be critical over the next century. We design clothing that is designed for climate change, space colonization, resource scarcity. So we really think about the big challenges of the next century and design clothes against them rather than, hundreds of red t-shirts made in China. That's not what we do.
And it's the thing that I love to start with. I mean, just that application of thinking about what's going to happen over the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years and thinking about how to do the right thing with a visionary element to it, utilizing technology, because you do utilize a lot of innovation around technology in the things that you do. But how did you get to that? Was it you were sat in the pub one day, you're thinking, how do we do something completely different from anyone else? Why did you end up there?
Well, it was actually quite the opposite of sitting in a pub. I was running an ultramarathon across a desert, which is about as far, and it was in Namibia. So it's about as far away from the comfort as a pub as you could get. And I was effectively racing around the world with my brother, who I now run the company with. And we were put we chose to put ourselves in a series of quite difficult positions in the deserts, mountain ranges, Amazon jungle. And effectively what happened during those experiences is we faced a number of really intense physical and psychological challenges. And we felt quite naked in a very weird way. The clothes that we thought were supposed to help us didn't really. In fact, they would sort of cut you. Because once you start running in 100 miles, the skin falls off your legs and you're your toenails fall off because your shoes stop working properly. And what we realized is that clothes just simply weren't very advanced. And so it was at the same time when Tesla had come out, Apple was a huge brand, and you could see all these advances in all these other areas. And it felt to me like clothing hadn't really advanced particularly. While you're told it has, and all the sort of stars are being paid hundreds of millions of pounds to wear different brands, if you actually get to the heart of it, over 75% of the world's clothing is still made of cotton. The second biggest thing is polyester. We've had cotton for literally millennia. We've had polyester for probably over 100 years. And you just go, and it's all dyed with the same stuff it was dyed with in the late 1890s. You just go, it just isn't advanced. All that's really changing is logos. And maybe the cold weather gear has got a bit better. And, Amundsen and Scott would have kept a few more fingers and toes if they'd worn some better brands. But we just couldn't see any advances being made. And we wondered if that was to do with the fact that all the big companies who had the money to innovate were actually more concerned with their stock price than they were with innovation. And so we kind of thought, well, what if we set up as almost a lab within a lab within a lab, and we only do the crazy stuff? What would that look like? And that's where we started. So from a frustration born out of a real world experience, and then a quiet wondering of, I wonder why no one's doing this, and then a sort of quick realization of the way that market forces effectively shape innovation, and are wondering if a startup couldn't break that. And then in the history of innovation, as you know, there is a long history of startups shattering status quos. And so we naively thought, let's be one of them. That's how it actually started. And that took place over the course, I'd say, 2 to 3 years, realistically. It wasn't a light bulb moment.
And I can now understand why you've got the range of running clothes that weigh nothing, and the light sensitive jacket that enables you to see each other as you're running kind of in the dark in those situations. So actually it's really interesting to see the story translate to some of the things that you've then produced. But you come at it in terms of thinking about that future. Some of the clothing ranges are based on sustainability in terms of appropriate sourcing and thinking about how they age. Some of them are kind of thinking about it in the context of ensuring that they're less throwaway. I mean, kind of your 100-year range of hoodies and various other clothing is coming out from a different angle. How did you end up on those in terms? I mean, they sit aside next to each other. They're all linked in terms of reimagining that future and innovating. How would you pick, or how would you, if we're talking about listeners thinking back to CDR and digital responsibility and innovating to make a positive impact on people and planet, which ones would you pick out as illustrating some of those sustainability principles, for example?
Well, it's a brilliant question. I mean, where we started off essentially was really rejecting the idea of one solution fits all, which in clothing, we've got this miracle technology that solves all problems under the sun, or, one killer app. I just don't really kind of buy that. And so when, for instance, we looked at sustainability, one way absolutely is to go with clothes that are made from nature with as little energy as possible. And, we took it to such an extent that you could bury ours in the ground in your garden because we thought that was funny. But it's so myopic to go that there's only one solution to it. So the other question we wanted to address is, most clothes are typically worn for 2 years, kept for 10, and then they go onto a rubbish dump. And the logical answer to that is, well, why don't we just make clothes that last a lot longer? And so we attempted to make clothes that would last 100 years. Now, I don't see the idea of clothing that was built to outlive you necessarily fighting a piece of clothing that's made from eucalyptus or seaweed or whatever substance it is we choose to make from. I think they sit absolutely on the same line of tackling the same challenge. They're just at other ends of the spectrum. And then our third solution, alongside clothes made from nature and clothes designed to outlive you, was a whole range built from garbage. And so we effectively intercept a lot of materials that are heading to the dump, some as typical as polyester or cotton or plastic bottles, some as crazy as firefighter suits and mashed up bulletproof vests, and we intercept them. And I feel that all three of those are acceptable solutions to the same challenge. And I feel that as a brand, I wanted to be really honest about the challenges that the clothing industry did face. And rather than sort of, I won't name and shame brands because they're bigger than us, they might want to sue us. But rather than saying, hey, we've solved it, we've got this miracle material and sustainability is cracked, it's absolute nonsense. Because sustainability isn't cracked unless we go back to the state we were in 2,000 years ago, which is we were making our own clothes from locally sourced furs and fibers that you can throw away in the forest. Once we all do that, sustainability is cracked. And until we can do that, it's not. And so our preference was to be completely transparent, look at multiple solutions to the same problem, and talk openly and honestly about where we are with each one, because none of them are ideal. And they never are going to be ideal. But I don't see society adopting nakedness and nudity as a way forward. So we're going to have to wear clothes. Lots of people like them to be different colors and feel nice and have soft textures. So we, I think, to a degree, have started a more open debate around that, where I know that quite big clothing brands have had to look at some of the stuff we're doing and challenge themselves internally on how they're answering questions.
And I think that's a really important point, because if I kind of talk more broadly around digital responsibility and innovating with technology to solve some of the world's biggest problems, any organization in any market sector can do things better than they are doing today. And it's about showing the art of the possible, showing how something can be done differently, that triggers change on a broader scale. It's not about being perfect all of a sudden. It's about showing what can be done. So I'm interested in your innovation process. So how would you go about thinking, here's that concept, and how do I innovate and find a new waste product or a new technology that enables us to do something differently without giving away any trade secrets, I hasten to add. But can you give some insight as to just how people think about new stuff for your ranges?
Of course. So how we think about it, in a very practical way, it starts in two methods typically. The first is quite philosophical. We think about what practical challenges do we think humanity is going to face over the next century that we would like to take on. Now, obviously, there's a long list of challenges humanity is going to face that clothing has no ability or right to interfere with because it has a limited capacity to change things. But we start philosophically. So I'll give you a really good example. Was one idea that we were throwing around years and years ago before we'd actually even started the brand was the idea of how do we not carry diseases from Earth up to space. And that's something that NASA are working on, the European Space Agency are working on. Lots of people are thinking about this because if we are ever to sort of, terraform other planets, maybe we don't want to take the common cold or influenza with us. It might be a good idea not to. And so that challenge was eventually solved when we found a material that we then helped develop, made almost entirely out of copper. It was 60% copper, and copper is bacteriostatic. It's got a really wonderful thing called a halo effect, which kills various diseases and viruses. And we just thought, what a perfect solution to this problem. Then I wonder if it's possible to make clothes out of metal. And then you go through a whole other kind of innovation process, which is, well, how do you make that piece of material into a wearable piece of clothing? What factories can actually have got the equipment to cut and bond metal and make it waterproof? What testing does it have to go through to sort of prove it does these things? And so there's a big gap between an idea and an execution. An idea you can come up with on a whim. An execution might take 5 years. So it's like me saying I'd like to win the 100 meters at the next Olympics. Well, brilliant. Well, I'm 44 and I'm 5'7", and so we're probably going to say that's unlikely. So my idea is good, great. You want to win a gold medal at the Olympics. The execution, well, it might never happen, or even if I train really hard for the next 5 years. So that's one way, philosophical. The other way is magpie tendencies. Essentially, we are always talking to we're very lucky, some of our, we've managed to build a group of customers who are really smart. There's no other way of putting it. The group of customers we have are some of the people thinking the most exciting things about some of the most fundamental challenges that we face. So some of them are incredible filmmakers, philosophers, scientists, adventurers, designers. And we talk to them. We talk to them a lot. And people send us stuff and they go, hey, there's this crazy new material. Have you seen it? Or I've got this challenge when I'm deep sea diving. And so we try and think in a very magpie-like way, which is fusing lots of different other people's neurons firing in their brains. And we try and glue them together and go, brilliant. This person asked for this and we found this crazy material. What if we solved it with this? And so there's a structured philosophical method, and then there's a more accidental magpie method. And it's that old adage, isn't it? The more I practice, the luckier I get. Actually, ours is the more people we know, the luckier we get. And eventually we become sort of an interesting innovation platform where people know that they can send interesting ideas into and we might do something with it. So lots and lots of people for the first 5 years asked us, could we work on an invisibility cloak? No. And if we could, I'd be a billionaire, and we probably wouldn't be chatting. I'd be on a private island somewhere.
Didn't I see an example one when I came into the workshop?
You did. What you saw was a first prototype called a thermal camouflage jacket, where we effectively flood hundreds of layers of graphene with electricity and ionic liquid. And we can change the thermal output of any of those graphene pixels on an infrared camera, which is, on the way to an invisibility jacket, even if it's step 1 of 500. But, enough people asked, can you build a Harry Potter cloak? That, when you finally see someone who's got an exciting piece of technology, which we did, we asked to work with them on it and said, well, why don't we build something to prove this could be done? So that's sort of, I suppose, fortune favoring the brave is that innovation strategy.
But it's just a brilliant example of a conversation around CDR and technology, around AI, for example. Everyone's talking about AI at the moment quite reasonably in terms of some of the impact of some of the things that we're seeing, especially around Gen AI. And we can have conversations around regulation and policy and what you can't do or shouldn't do. And we can have conversations around how you innovate using those technologies to kind of solve some problems or do some amazing things. And yes, probably do some bad things as well. But if we can focus on how can we do some amazing things and how do we realize some of those imagined visions or positive futures that kind of seem better maybe than the dystopian futures, then surely that's the way that we can continue to evolve, which is what I love around the things that you're doing, because it's very much coming from how can you reimagine that future, and then how the hell do you actually find a way to execute something that's in that theme or illustrating that. Tell me about some of the things that you've been launching more recently. I've seen some pigment dyes kind of back to the earth, so to speak. But what's exciting you about the things that are coming out at the moment?
I think genuinely the things that excite me most are where they've never been done before. That's the thing that I sort of get up for, where I go, wow, no one saw that coming. I think I'll use 2 very different competing examples. One is probably the most advanced thing we've made to date that will be commercially available as opposed to a pure concept piece. And that's called a Martian aerogel jacket, which is made out of 2 technologies, both developed for NASA on behalf of NASA. One took 20 years, the other took 15. So the outer shell of this jacket is a parachute material, the strongest parachute material ever built. It's the same parachute that landed the last rover on Mars and the first probe on Titan. So it has to go from, I think it's something like Mach 16 to 200 miles an hour in under 2 seconds. So it has to be unbelievably strong brake power. That's the outside of the jacket. And then the inside is a crazy new aerogel. Aerogel is the lightest solid material in the world. Some friends of ours, also a customer, was working on a very new type, which they're also working on the stuff that will coat the next Mars rover as it enters the Mars atmosphere. And that's what we built a jacket out of. So that makes me very excited, because, I mean, it's just bonkers, right? It's an example of what can be done. And so what's interesting about that is you probably don't say that there's a need for that, but there's a want for it. That's at one end of the spectrum where we go, can this even be done? How do we sort of combine these materials that are designed for such different purposes? At the other end of the spectrum, it's sort of much simpler, but I really enjoyed it. We do think a lot about how clothing is dyed. Clothing is dyed in the wrong way. It's all from the chemicals explosion of sort of post 1870s from one chemist in London. And up until then, we've been using sort of fruits and vegetables and all sorts of different things to dye clothing. And now we're sort of a petrochemical industry. We are looking at a whole series of different ways of getting away from that, from black algae to pigments like ochre. We've used volcanic soils. We've just used seledenite and hematite, these sort of prehistoric minerals, tiny quantities of them. I think volcanic soil was probably my most fun one that we just did. Just to say your t-shirt was dyed in a giant vat of volcanic soil is just fun, because I can tell you most t-shirts are not dyed in a vat of volcanic soil. They're dyed in petrochemicals and then they're pumped out into rivers. And so I think what's really interesting is some of the challenges we take on are actually invisible to the industry. It's beneficial to the industry to hide some of the challenges that exist, what manufacturing practices exist, what sweatshops exist, how color is actually made. And so whilst we're only a small brand with a small and pretty loyal following, asking those questions is interesting. Because I don't see lots of other people doing it in an all-encompassing way like we are. They might take on one little challenge and go, we've cracked this, but we're kind of taking on all the sacred cows at once and going, I wonder what happens if you break all of these. So those are sort of two very recent challenges, volcanic soil and, the parachute that will land the next rover on Mars. Two very, very different things, but sort of tackling the same problem.
And as you've mentioned Mars, I have to kind of mention the was it a zero gravity jacket? The pocket was upside down, and I still couldn't work out how I would use that. How I would put something in the pocket without it falling out.
Yeah, so that was our first ever Mars jacket, and it had two rather novel pockets. So one was a vomit pocket, and it was sort of a 3D printed cap, which you opened up, and underneath it was a bright orange sick bag. And that's for when your vestibular system goes haywire in zero gravity. The common reaction is to puke, unless you're a trained astronaut. The other pocket, even more novel, was an upside down zero gravity pocket, which it's pretty much a Simpsons joke, isn't it? The pocket the wrong way around. However, if you go into the inside of the jacket, the pocket's the right way around. So should you be standing upright, you open it from the inside. And if you are upside down, you open it from the outside.
It's about understanding the tricks. The bit that I love, though, is that it's that mix of very serious things, i.e. kind of the innovation and thinking about sustainability and longevity and reimagining that future, but with a bit of fun and a bit of excitement as well, because it needs to land with people. It needs to be real. It needs to excite others. It needs to inspire other organizations who maybe look at some of the things that you're doing, pick some of those things up and start to reimagine how they do that differently, maybe on a kind of larger scale. Are you seeing some of that I think you hinted at it earlier, in terms of seeing some of the bigger organizations maybe being inspired or feeling that they need to respond to some of the things that you're doing?
We're very open, and we've certainly had some very interesting and much bigger companies than ours come and have a nose around of what we're doing, physically. We invite them in and we say, look, here's what we're doing, here's what we're working on. So we are seeing that impact. Now, how that company then responds and how it goes down from a sort of, head of innovation level through to actually getting out into the market, I can't control that, but I can certainly make sure that their interest is piqued, or perhaps their noses are put slightly out of joint, whichever one it is, and they want to come and have a look at what's going on. So I know that is definitely happening. And interestingly, across a range of industries, that's not just people in clothing. There's some people in technology and some other industries who've come to sort of, chat about what we're doing. And so I do think that is positive, and I am always very willing and open to share what we're working on, because there's no trade secrets. There's just a couple of weird brains in an office going, I wonder what happens if we do this. So we are seeing that impact. And the way I think about it, and I agree, we definitely try and do some serious stuff, but we also try and have fun, because I'm a huge fan of Charlie Brooker and Black Mirror, and he strikes the balance really beautifully of, if it was all unremittingly awful and dystopian and depressing, that's a different kind of series. But when he throws bits of he throws you some light relief occasionally and some humor occasionally, and he makes you realize that you're actually a participant in this narrative of the future as well. I think especially with that one-off he did, Bandersnatch, where you had to interact and you got to decide the future. I think there's a real element that we do get to write our own future, and you don't have to write a tragedy. And so whilst we do definitely touch on some what you might describe as dystopian topics, the world overheating, the apocalypse, we've designed an entire range for the apocalypse, or complete resource scarcity, you can still have a little bit of fun with it, because I think it's Lord Reith who set up the BBC, and he said you have to entertain to educate. I think if you just deliver a series of unremittingly dour lectures, no one's going to listen. But if you talk about the future in a kind of interesting, fun way that can pique people's interest, I think you can hold them for a lot longer, and I think you can talk about more serious things with them.
It's almost a brilliant way to finish, because I remember in 2016 standing in Paris talking about Black Mirror, as one of the key reasons why we needed to look at the impact of technology on society as a whole. So I held up Black Mirror and I held up The Circle and Ready Player One as near dystopian futures to say kind of, well, we should do something different. So I find it fascinating in the conversation that although we, you and I, do very different things in our backgrounds in terms of technologists, although the touch of that and fashion, actually there's this commonality around how do we kind of bring things together, and how do we get inspiration from interesting places to make a real difference on those futures for everybody, whether it's directly or indirectly through the through inspiring others. If there's one thing that you would pick as a final comment in terms of inspiring others, no matter what they do, to do things differently in their industry, what would that message be?
Well, certainly from my experience, it's to not believe the conventional wisdom that the market leaders will always be the market leaders, and that it is possible for a couple of people, or in our case, sort of 30, 40 people who think quite radically to disrupt the status quo. And so it's often quite depressing to think, well, this market leader, they have 100,000 employees and their market cap is $1 trillion and we'll never overtake them. But I think you have to approach with the mindset that they too will die. This too shall pass, and therefore someone has to replace them, and it could be you. And I think if more people have that mindset, it would be better, which is you don't accept the world at face value. And the way I sort of try and remind myself of that is if we all come back in 100 years, none of us are here anymore. Everything's changed. And so you just have to sort of adopt that mindset on a slightly smaller scale and go, well, that could also be true in 10 years' time, then couldn't it? And that's why you start ideas now, because actually you might be able to, affect a century's change in a decade if your idea is good enough.
The one thing, of course, that we do know is that the 100-year hoodie will still be there.
I have one of our customers has written it into his will and last testament that he's going to be cremated in it, because the joke is he wants to be a skeleton wearing the 100-year hoodie.
Which is a superb way to finish the conversation. Steve, it's been fantastic to kind of explore kind of what Vollebak and your passion for it kind of shines through. So just brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much.